Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you're all safe and sound. So again, hello and welcome to this week's webinar. My name is Susie Gelman. I'm privileged to serve as board chair of Israel Policy Forum. I want to welcome those of you who are joining Israel Policy Forum for the first time today, and welcome back our returning viewers. Before we begin, I want to thank our supporters. Our work, including today's program, is made possible by you. If you don't yet support our work, please do so by visiting www.israelpolicyforum.org/support. Now on to today's briefing. President Biden's intention to reopen the US Consulate-General in Jerusalem, which was merged into the US Embassy by former President Trump, is an ongoing source of tension between the US administration and Naftali Bennett's government. While Prime Minister Bennett and other prominent leaders of the coalition view reopening the consulate as an infringement on Israel's sovereignty in Jerusalem, the US sees it as a necessary step to serve American interests in the region. This issue has regularly made headlines in recent weeks, with some reports suggesting that the United States might move towards reopening the consulate in the near future. We're grateful to be joined today by Shira, Efron, and Michael Koplow to help us unpack this controversy. Shira is a policy director here at Israel Policy Forum, and she also serves as a senior fellow at INSS in Tel Aviv and as a special advisor for the RAND Corporation. Michael Koplow is Israel Policy Forum's chief policy officer. As always, we encourage you to ask questions of our speakers. Please type your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. A recording of this broadcast will be published later on our website at www.israelpolicyforum.org/briefings. So with that, Shira and Michael, thank you so much for joining us. And Michael, Mazal Tov once more on your daughter Kira becoming a bat mitzvah last Shabbat.
Thank you.
Michael, please provide us with some background on this issue. What is the history of the US Consulate-General in Jerusalem, and how did it serve US interests in the Israeli-Palestinian arena? Why was it shuttered by the Trump administration, and why does President Biden want to reopen it?
Thanks, Susie. The U.S. consulate in Jerusalem had been open since the 19th century. It was opened by the United States during the Ottoman Empire. Actually, the building itself, which is now officially the U.S. ambassador's residence, is the oldest United States diplomatic building overseas. I think 1844 is, if memory serves correctly, is the date. And traditionally, the consulate served as a U.S. mission to the Palestinians, because the U.S. embassy was in Tel Aviv, and obviously there are very few Palestinians in Tel Aviv. It was easier to have the consulate serve as effectively as a mission, not officially, but effectively as a mission to the Palestinians. And the Consulate-General, or the Consul-General, who was in charge of the consulate, traditionally reported directly back to the State Department, as opposed to reporting back to the embassy. And what this meant was that, given the United States has had to deal with two separate populations, Israelis and Palestinians, and given that the West Bank and Gaza are not part of Israel, they have not been annexed by Israel, this way the State Department could be hearing the unfiltered views of things from the Israeli side and the unfiltered views of things from the Palestinian side. In addition, while the embassy was in Tel Aviv, which was the case, all the way up until 2018, this meant that there was a U.S. diplomatic presence in Jerusalem, which was important as well. When the Trump administration and President Trump announced its intention in December 2017 to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Israel, something that then happened in spring of 2018. In their view, it made the consulate unnecessary because you now had the embassy in Jerusalem, so the consulate didn't have to stand as a separate diplomatic mission in Jerusalem. And so in October 2018, Secretary of State Pompeo announced that the consulate would be closed and it would be merged into the US Embassy, and basically be renamed as the Palestinian Affairs Unit in the embassy. Now, interestingly, when President Trump announced recognition of Jerusalem as the capital and announced that the embassy was going to move to Jerusalem, that day, December 6, 2017, he said that this move was intended to recognize Jerusalem as capital of Israel, but it was not intended to be a statement on sovereignty in Jerusalem or the borders of Jerusalem, or intended to be a statement about the US position on final status issues. And when Secretary Pompeo announced that the consulate would merge into the embassy in 2018, nearly 1 year later, what he said at the time was that it was being done. He couched it in the Trump administration's efforts globally to improve efficiency and effectiveness of operations. And what he said at the time in a statement was that it did not signal a change of US policy in Jerusalem, the West Bank, or the Gaza Strip. And so it was portrayed as basically an administrative move. And what we have seen since the consulate was closed and the Palestinian Affairs Unit was created is that the Palestinians have been very reluctant to engage with the United States through the Palestinian Affairs Unit. And for that reason, among others, and I'm sure we'll get into the others, the Biden administration during the campaign announced its intention to reopen the consulate. And at the moment, there is this tussle going on between the Biden administration and the Bennett-Lapid government over whether the consulate should or even can be reopened.
Michael, before I turn to Shira, I just want to ask a follow-up to what you've just been discussing. I was going to ask you, first of all, how many Palestinians are going to the Palestinian Affairs Department? And I think you pretty much answered that. But if I'm not mistaken, it's also relevant from an Israeli security standpoint, right? Because having a presence, it was a way of having a more open line of communication with Palestinians. So if there were potential, matters of unrest, or like what we saw in May, during the time of the conflagration with Gaza, but there was a lot of unrest in the West Bank. I mean, are those the kinds of things that having a consulate general that services primarily the Palestinian population in some way could also be affected by, having sort of more ears and eyes on the ground, if you will?
Yeah, so there are logistical, tangible logistical problems with keeping the consulate closed, and there are also symbolic problems with keeping the consulate closed. And I assume we'll get into both of these in a bit more depth. But from a logistics perspective, absolutely, when you have the consulate that was dedicated to the Palestinians, it meant that the United States was able to have a better handle on what was going on, because the consul in Jerusalem would frequently meet with Palestinian leaders, not just the PA, not just the Palestinian Authority, but business leaders and civil society leaders and academics, and get a pretty full range of views of what was going on within the Palestinians. But yes, it also gave the United States a more direct line to the Palestinians on the ground to be able to try and cut off problems at the pass. And in theory, that can be done through the Palestinian Affairs Unit in the embassy, but only to the extent that the Palestinians are willing to engage with that unit. If they're not, then it means that our engagement with the Palestinians effectively becomes through the CIA and nothing else. And while obviously intelligence relationships are valuable, it's not the full range of what the United States is generally used to being able to do when it comes to talking to the Palestinians.
So just to be clear, once the Consulate-General was closed, that meant that the U.S. consul no longer had a position, right?
Correct.
And so
there's currently a head of the Palestinian Affairs Unit in the embassy, but that is not.
That's a very different position, obviously, than consul.
Right.
Shira, please walk us through what it would take for the U.S. to reopen the consulate. Does it need Israel's consent to do so? And what has the dialogue been like so far between Israelis and American officials on this matter? And finally, what weight do you give to reports that the United States might move to reopen the consulate as soon as next month?
Well, thank you, Susie. Well, there are three questions, and I guess the first one is more theoretical. What it would take, the United States has property in West Jerusalem. It also has property in East Jerusalem, and theoretically, it can rent another property, right? So the problem is that reopening or opening a diplomatic mission is more complex than that. So first of all, there's the logistical hurdle of just security and those issues that you have to take care of, and that would also depend on the location that you choose. But when you talk about Jerusalem, it's not just location, right? It's all very political. Second, there's the legal question, which is because the United States now recognizes, because the United States has now an embassy in Jerusalem, can it also have a consulate-general in a city where it has an embassy already? Now, there's no strict law, and lawyers can find different ways around it, but this is a question. But the final point, I think, and this is the most important one, is the question of Israeli consent. Because, it's funny, when we wrote about this in January, anticipating this should have been the easiest move on the the administration's part, but we kind of foresaw the complexities. And we said the United States can't just slide into a building and say, hey, we're here, turn a sign on, although some people are suggesting it, so we can get to this in a second. When you need a visa, all diplomats going to be based in Jerusalem need a visa, a diplomatic visa. Israel has to approve these visas. Israel has to, Israeli police helps provide security. Of course, there are other security considerations that you have to provide. This is, the state of Israel. You can't, we'll talk about the unilateral option in a second, but I think Israel has to approve this. Discussion so far has been, to my understanding, there are many people on the right, and I want to share with you, if you have a moment, just to read some quotes on people on the right saying that Israel should just say flatly no to the Americans. And when you're asking about the dialogue so far, knowing Israel, no one is saying no, right? They're saying, well, you can do this, but the implications are that this will break our coalition. I think this is where it gets interesting. It's true, the United States says that, the incoming, Biden promised it during the campaign, after election, Secretary Blinken was here in Israel, said this, but at the time, Netanyahu was prime minister. And not that this necessarily changes the calculus. The motivation for reopening the consulate were not that Netanyahu was the prime minister, but there was anticipation, that he would be under fire from contenders on the right, and maybe that he can handle it or not. What Naftali Bennett, and not just him, not just right-wing members of this coalition, also Yair Lapid, what they're saying is, well, if you do this, that would be the end of us. That will break the coalition. At first, we thought of it would be, okay, let's just pass the budget, which will happen next month, and then the coalition will be more stable. But what I'm hearing now is that Israeli officials are saying to the US, no, this would be a cause to break the government even after the budget, and that's why you shouldn't do it. So when we go to your third question, what do I make of the reports of this happening as early as next month? I wouldn't bet on it. I think that if it happens, it's going to take much longer. I know some people are suggesting for the State Department just to operate unilaterally and find some creative ideas. This is possible. It could provide some options so the Israeli government can say, we really oppose this. They just did it unilaterally. But I don't know that this is the way the administration wants to do it. And frankly, and this goes also to what Michael said, initially, the Palestinians repairing ties with the Palestinians. The consulate was one way of repairing ties with the Palestinians who didn't engage with the Americans, but now they're engaging regularly. So also on the incentive side, on the Palestinian side, I think the incentives now are a little bit lower than they were before. And I got to tell you, I don't know if you read, there was a big report about it in Israel Hayom, and with interviews with Dory Gold and Michael Oren, so two people, American Israeli officials, knowing the Americans very well. And I mean, Dory Gold says that Israel should exact a price from the US if it does so, expanding the boundaries of Jerusalem. Michael Oren says we shouldn't be baby speaking about this, but this is a strategic issue. And theoretically, Israel can also shut the electricity down to the consulate. These are very harsh statements from people that know how to weigh their words. So this is a thorny issue. My hunch, and we can speak about this, I don't know anyone in the Israeli government that really wants to lose its cabinet, his or her cabinet position. And I don't think the Israeli public has any appetite for elections, but it is a difficult topic, a difficult issue now.
And if I can just kind of build on something Shira said, the political temperature on this is getting raised in a way that is a bit surprising proportionally when you think about what we're actually talking about, which is, you know, reopening a small office that was open from 1844 until 2018. You know, Shira picked up on that Michael Oren comment where, you know, he said you can cut electricity and water to the building. He's talking about a United States diplomatic building.
As a former diplomat himself.
As someone who's running at the moment for head of the Jewish agency, you know, seeking to represent effectively Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews, talking about cutting off water and electricity to a U.S. diplomatic facility. We've had Nir Barkat in the United States now twice since the Biden administration has taken office for the sole purpose of lobbying the administration and Congress against the consulate. And just this morning, there's a bill that was introduced in the Senate by Senator Haggerty, and I think it has 32 or 33 original co-sponsors, seeking to enshrine in U.S. law that the consulate cannot be reopened. So this has become, you know, a political issue in a way where, you know, it seems absurd that this could bring down an Israeli coalition, but, you know, I've heard the same thing from Israeli officials that Shira has, that this isn't about the budget passing, that, you know, if it happens, it will break the coalition no matter when. And we see it now becoming an issue in U.S. politics as well.
We already have a number of great questions from the audience in the queue, but I just want to remind people, please, if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box and I will get to as many of them in a few minutes. Shira, back to you. Why has reopening the consulate been met with so much opposition from Prime Minister Bennett and many of his political partners? How are domestic political considerations in Israel playing into this issue? And feel free to read some of those, you know, well, you read some quotes, but if there's anything else to give us more color, because I think it's interesting to hear people's words and descriptions.
Yeah, you know, I think the theory is that by reopening the consulate, it means that you revert to old American policy, which, remind everyone, was nonpartisan, longstanding, traditional US policy, and all the years, right, that seeks to divide Jerusalem and establish a Palestinian capital, right? Because this is what it is. Trump was an aberration in terms of its change in policy and approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also him, as Michael said, when they decided to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, they didn't deliberate on the future borders of the city. So in a sense, although in their Peace to Prosperity plan, what the Palestinians received as a capital in Jerusalem were two neighborhoods that are really outside of Jerusalem, and Abu Dis, which is outside of Jerusalem, which is really not part of Jerusalem. But the thing is that what the Israeli right is saying, not just the right, which is where I think the problem is, that if it was coming just from the right, that would have been a problem. But the fact that it's more mainstream is that this is reality now. And we don't care what the US policy was back then. The reality now is that you recognize Jerusalem as our capital, and we are not going to agree to a Palestinian capital here. And by having a consulate, it means that you foresee another capital here and a division of this city. I don't know, what the Prime Minister himself thinks of that. We heard the statements, we heard from the right, but I think they're under such pressure from the right. There's, what Netanyahu is going to turn this into, right? As head of opposition, he's turning there are minor things that he's turning into really scandals. And they feel that this is really a fragile coalition. But I think, to be honest, and I don't know, right? Everyone has their risk calculation. This coalition is really strange in a sense that every party has to succeed, right? This is their only chance, and they have cabinet positions. It's hard for me to believe that any of them will actually break the coalition over this. And I got to tell you, sitting in Israel now, the Israeli public, do you think the Israeli public, except for a very small minority, really cares where the Palestinians get their students' visas from? I mean, this is way more turned, as Michael said, right? It turned into an issue, whereas it shouldn't have become such an issue. I think that's my view.
Michael, anything you have to add, or we'll move on to the next question?
Yeah,
go ahead.
We can go to the next question.
Okay, so this is for you, Michael. How does this issue fit into the context of US-Palestinian relations in the current moment? And what are the implications on US-PA ties if Biden does not fulfill his promise to reopen the consulate?
As Shira noted, since the Biden administration took office, the Palestinians have been engaging more with the Palestinian Affairs Unit on the assumption that the consulate was going to be reopened. So if the consulate isn't reopened, my strong hunch is that the Palestinians will stop engaging with the Palestinian Affairs Unit and we'll be back where we were before. And the Palestinians have really seized on this. The Palestinians had lots of high hopes when President Biden took office about all the things he would do. There were Palestinian officials who were circulating kind of lists in DC about the various things they wanted to see happen. And I think that they had unrealistic expectations at the start about just what they would be getting from the Biden administration. But even setting what I think were unrealistic expectations aside, so far they seem to be disappointed in a variety of ways. And I think that they're now looking at the consulate, sort of as a litmus test for whether they will actually be able to reestablish cordial or effective relations with the United States or not. And so the same way that the Israelis have elevated this now into a huge political issue, I think the Palestinians are and have elevated it into a big issue as well. But leaving the logistics aside, there is the reason behind wanting to reopen the consulate isn't only logistics, it's also symbolic, which is that the embassy to Israel is the embassy to Israel. People might remember that when the Biden administration took office, whoever's in charge of the US Embassy's Twitter account changed the profile name for one day on the Twitter account to read US Embassy to Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. And this caused a firestorm, and it quickly got switched back. It obviously wasn't an actual policy change. It was whoever controlled the social media account. But the point is that it's not the US Embassy to Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. It's the US Embassy to Israel. And so the notion that the Palestinians should be interacting with the United States through the embassy to Israel and not through some sort of separate diplomatic mission sends this message that we consider all this as one state, that we consider Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza as a single territory, and that we consider Palestinians to be a subset of Israel and Israelis. And Israelis don't consider that to be the case, and certainly the United States doesn't consider that to be the case. And so while it is true that, as far as I know, the United States doesn't anywhere operate a consulate in the same city where it operates an embassy, it is also, as far as I know, the case that there's no other situation where you have this entire population that are not citizens of the country to which you have an embassy that are told that they have to interact with the United States through the embassy. So, we're kind of in uncharted territory and a unique situation, no matter how you look at it. And from a symbolic perspective, I think that if the United States wants to be very clear that it supports a two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, having a separate mission that deals with the Palestinians so they don't have to go through the embassy, is what makes sense, leaving the logistics of it aside.
Michael, just as a quick follow-up to what you just said, so you referred to the way the Israelis are kind of really ramping this up into a major issue, and now it looks like the Palestinians are jumping onto that bandwagon as well. What, if you had to say today, October 26th, what the US government will do, what this administration will do, I mean, including any sources you might have within the administration, what's your read?
My read is that the administration is very cognizant of the fact that then candidate Biden, and since then President Biden, has promised to reopen the consulate. That Secretary Blinken, said it while he was in the region, and then said it again while he was standing next to Foreign Minister Lapid a couple of weeks ago. And so I think that they are determined to do something. But as Shira noted and as I've noted, the temperature on this is now so high that I think it makes it difficult to simply have kind of a big ceremony whereby you reopen the consulate. And so I suspect that what will eventually happen is some sort of compromise or some sort of deal whereby perhaps the Palestinian Affairs Unit in the embassy works out of a separate office somewhere else in Jerusalem, and they are in a diplomatic annex, and you don't call it the consulate. Something to that effect, or perhaps you open, you keep the PAU staff where they are, and you open up a small symbolic office somewhere else. Which I should note, most U.S. embassy staff still operates out of Tel Aviv. For all intents and purposes, the embassy in Jerusalem is a symbolic office, and staff is located elsewhere. So you could sort of do something similar. But I think I don't get the sense that the Biden administration is willing to call the Israeli government's bluff that it will collapse. But I also don't think, given the priorities that they have elsewhere, that this is a hill on which they want to make this big stand. So I think that something will be worked out, but I will be surprised if it is what the administration envisioned back in January.
Shira, do you want to add anything from your perspective on that?
No, I think Mike covered it pretty well.
Okay. All right. So Shira, I'm going to start with you on this question. Last week, Barak Ravid reported in Axios that the US and Israel were planning on forming a joint team to negotiate a compromise. What is the likelihood that such an initiative would succeed, and what potential compromises exist? I mean, Michael did talk about that, but since Barak Ravid reported it, I just wonder if you have any additional thoughts on that angle.
Well, I think the impetus for opening this working group on an issue, Israel and the US, they have working groups on qualitative military edge, on Iran, like on really major strategic issues. So having a working group on this, I find, is really an interesting choice. I think the impetus was that the US, the administration felt that it's not okay for Israel to say, never. This will always be a really risky thing for us. And this will always, never mind, we spoke initially about the budget, but even after the budget, this will risk the stability of the coalition. And the request is, okay, so find solutions, find suggestions. So Michael presented his suggestions. I know that many Israelis would really like the US to open a consulate in Abu Dis. Frankly, I think this would be a terrible decision. It would achieve neither objective, and the Palestinians would certainly oppose this because it would look to them as if the U.S. is, basically fulfilling the Trump administration plan of turning Abu Dhabi to the Palestinian capital. There's, of course, if you do some sort of a Ramallah option, then another one in Jerusalem. But there's not a whole universe of options, right? It's very difficult to be creative here at the end of the day. If the US has an official diplomatic mission that serves the Palestinians, people will know about it. And Israel will have to come to terms with what it wants to do. If the United States decides to go ahead with what they promised and what they said, which I think is a big issue. I think for Israel, it's in Israel's interest that the US would look like a credible actor and that it keeps its word. So I think it's really in Israel's interest. And, with what Michael said about the PA maybe stopping to engage with the Palestinian Affairs units, I mean, maybe, but maybe not, right? And this is also what's the incentive on that part, right? If you do this sort of cost benefit, if we're trying to repair ties with the Palestinians, so far it's working, and we really don't want to undermine the stability of the Israeli coalition. For now, we're going to keep this going, but it would be, it's probably going to be a subject we keep talking about, especially when there's an ambassador here on the ground.
Michael, do you have, I want to ask a follow-up unless you want to add to what Shira said, but my follow-up is also, if the two sides are unable to reach a compromise, what are the implications for US-Israel relations and US-Palestinian relations?
Was that for Shira or for me?
I think I will start with you on US-Israel relations, but it's really for both of you.
Sure.
And US-Palestinian relations.
I mean, the implications will be, it'll be up to both sides to determine how big of a deal they want to make of this. If the United States goes to the Israeli government and says, listen, this is something, we're going to do, and the Israeli government actively stops it, that of course that will cause a crisis. And, if the Israeli government says to the US, please do not do this, it's going to break the coalition, and the US government says, that's your problem, not ours, we don't care, that's also going to cause a crisis. So I think that it's really going to depend on the maneuvering. It's certainly not in either side's interest to have a giant public diplomatic spat. And it also seems to me, given the various issues at the moment in the US-Israel relationship that both sides want to deal with, this shouldn't be at the top of the list, right? In terms of what will cause a giant incident. I mean, frankly, at the moment, the United States probably is more concerned with some of the new Israeli construction that's been announced in the West Bank, and particularly that is in various stages in northeast, east, and south Jerusalem. And from the Israeli perspective, they are very focused on getting the United States to come up with some sort of plan B for Iran. If I were the Israeli government, I wouldn't want to risk a giant spat with the United States over a consulate in Jerusalem when you're trying to get the United States on board for some sort of way to deal with Iran, assuming that the Iran deal is really dead and buried. So, this just, as I said before, this doesn't seem like a hill that either side should want to die on. Nonetheless, we're kind of hurtling alarmingly fast toward that being the case. And so, I'm hopeful that the two sides will be able to work something out that, is, if not reopening the conflict as it was, some sort of compromise that allows each side to, claim victory in some way, shape, or form.
Shira, I want to turn to you for your perspective. If a compromise is not reached, what in your view are the implications both for the US-Israel relationship and the US relationship with the Palestinian Authority?
I mean, I think I agree with Michael. I honestly, and also when we wrote this in January, I thought this could be a great way for Israel, right, to show that it made sacrifice and pocket concessions on other major things. I think turning this into such this big elephant makes it really difficult to step away from it, right, and say like, actually, you know what, it's not a big deal, and it's just a symbolic act. So I hope they will find ways to, you know, we got to say, this is more general, right? We know this about Israelis and Palestinians. Both sides are very good at finding ladders to climb down from the trees that they, you know, so anyway, you get the metaphor, right? So we've seen this before. So I hope we'll see this again, that they find a compromise, because it's just really not worth picking a fight over this one. And I know that this coalition, that was part of its strategic objectives, right? Repair ties with the US, turn Israel again into a bipartisan issue, no surprises, right? So this is part of it. So I also think from the Biden administration, there's really no interest in picking a fight with Israel over this. So I hope they find a compromise. With the Palestinians, I heard from some Palestinians close to the officials with the PA that they feel that they miscalculated, that they really thought this was going to happen, and their decision to re-engage with the Americans was predicated on, this consulate promise. But they don't know that they have it in them, the option now to really say like, well, you promised, you didn't keep your promise, or we're again not engaging with you. There are really big things at stake. And they don't have many options, right? So this is something that I don't know if this is gonna sever ties between the US and the Palestinians, but remember, it's only on the initial stages of repairing those ties, right? And there's so much more to do. This was, again, I'm just reminding everyone, you know, reopening the PLO mission in Washington, restoring aid to the Palestinians, there's so many other bigger things. So this was supposed to be the easy one. And it's not happening anytime soon in my assessment.
So I want to turn to audience questions. We have a ton. It's a really great questions, and we have too many people to even name who've been asking about opening a Consulate-General in Ramallah. So you did refer that in passing, Shira, but I'm interested because there's so much interest in this audience about why not just open the Consulate-General in Ramallah or someplace else in the West Bank? I mean, you've already covered why Abu Dis would not be acceptable to the Palestinians, but could you talk a little further about why Ramallah is not, certainly from the PA perspective, from the Palestinian perspective, not an option, but what do you think of that? Because I mean, as I said, that many people in our audience think that that could be a compromise position.
I mean, I'll just be brief. It makes sense to have representation for the Palestinians in the West Bank, right? Because not every Palestinian can enter Jerusalem. It makes complete sense to have a consulate if you want something that's supposed to be an embassy one day. But we have to remember that Palestinians, and you know, the peace process, right? Negotiations on final status issues, Palestinians have a claim for a capital in Jerusalem also. And this is where, and that's why the symbolic, you know, there's the symbolism of it. You have representation there because you are, bipartisan US policy has always been that the two sides need to decide on the future of the city of Jerusalem, not the city of Ramallah, right? The city of Jerusalem in negotiations. So it doesn't mean that if you reopen this consulate, you shouldn't have a representation in Ramallah. That Ramallah, or you know, that would make sense. Like you always had an embassy in Tel Aviv, and even as Michael said now, and this is where actually most business is conducted from. But it doesn't preclude, you know, the still should be in Palestinian view a representation in Jerusalem.
And Michael, before you get to that, oh, sorry, one sec. I just want to follow with Shira and then turn to you, Michael, which is East Jerusalem, opening a Consulate-General in East Jerusalem. I take it, given your comments about Jerusalem, the status of Jerusalem as being something that has to be negotiated between the parties. Does that also apply? I mean, is there any universe in which East Jerusalem could be the location of some sort of presence, even if it's not a Consulate-General?
So I think East Jerusalem would be ideal for the Palestinians. Also, there are many people on the Israeli left that would be like, oh, great, because yeah, you don't have claims to West Jerusalem. and you do it in East Jerusalem, and there are 40% of Jerusalem city are Palestinian population. Makes a lot of sense. I think politically it could be more complicated in Israel to do it in East Jerusalem, because in East Jerusalem means that you're actually going to divide a city. If you're just going back, right, it's a turnkey. You're just doing what it used to be before. It's nothing. We're just restoring something that worked for a long time until 2 years ago when Trump was here and closed it. That makes it easier. So there are advantages and disadvantages to East Jerusalem location depending where you come from.
Michael?
Yeah, just to build on that, I mean, the idea that reopening the consulate on Agron Street, which is firmly in the heart of West Jerusalem, literally sitting between the plaza and the Waldorf. The idea that would be dividing Jerusalem doesn't really fly with me, because it's very clear that the U.S. recognizes, certainly West Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and that that will never be in contention. But in terms of Ramallah, there's just to build a bit more on what Shira said. To reiterate, both Trump and Pompeo, when they made the moves with regard to the embassy and the consulate, both went out of their way to state that this was not intended to be a policy or commentary on final status issues. And as Shira pointed out, Jerusalem is one of the 4 core final status issues. And so, putting the consulate back in Jerusalem isn't about dividing Jerusalem. It's about putting the United States in a position of saying, we recognize both sides have claims to the city. It's going to be up to the two of you to work out what that looks like in the event of a permanent status agreement, but we're not putting our thumb on the scale. But there's another problem with Ramallah, which is that it's very difficult logistically, because providing security for a diplomatic facility anywhere in Israel, and certainly in Jerusalem, is much easier than providing security for any type of diplomatic facility in Ramallah. And that's not something that the United States, wants to be doing. Recall that U.S. diplomats aren't even, supposed to be situated in the West Bank at all. So, it would present a huge security issue. I'd be shocked if anyone in diplomatic security at the State Department, would ever be in favor of or sign off putting a permanent diplomatic facility in Ramallah, given all the security problems that would entail.
Before I turn to other topics, I just want to ask a question that Jeff Daub is asking, which is, most of the visits to the embassy and consulate by Palestinians have involved acquiring visas for travel to the US. If the State Department includes Palestinians in their visa waiver program, there would be very few reasons to visit a diplomatic mission either in Jerusalem or Ramallah. Michael or Shira, do you think this could be an interim step to at least diffuse this confrontation?
Hi, Jeff. It could be, but the visa waiver program is never going to be enacted. Everyone knows that. Despite what President Biden said when Prime Minister Bennett visited DC, that was sort of a PR favor, I think, to Prime Minister Bennett. Everyone knows, and I've spoken to Israeli officials since that visit who have effectively said the same thing. That's not happening. There are simply too many hurdles, and it was kind of actually remarkable to see Ambassador Erdogan talk about it as if it was a done deal, when almost everyone involved on both sides knows that not only is it not a done deal, it's almost certainly not going to happen. Both because of Israeli policies at Ben Gurion Airport, and because which is something that Israel can control, and the huge percentage of Israelis in the United States who overstay their visas, which is not something the Israeli government can control. But by law, there's literally a statutory number there, and there are way more Israelis overstaying their visas than allow for a visa waiver to happen.
Shira, do you want to add anything before I go on to the next question?
No, I don't know if the question, if I heard that it was for Palestinians in the waiver program, which also.
Yes. Yeah.
Never.
That was it.
Right, and this, I think, even more so, not gonna happen, right? That's so. In addition to what Michael said, and yeah. So theoretically, it's a good solution. It's just not going to be.
It's not realistic. Okay. So Mark Widger asks, shouldn't the PA undertake some confidence building measures in order to have a US consulate?
So I'm not sure that they should take some confidence building measures to have a consulate. There are things that they have to do by law to get other things, such as the PLO mission in DC, which at the moment under the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act, by law the Palestinians can't. Not only can the PLO mission in DC not be reopened, the Palestinians can't have any diplomatic presence outside of their UN mission in the United States at all, and individual Palestinian officials cannot travel to the United States to carry out any activities on behalf of the PA unless it's meeting with U.S. government officials until they reform their martyr payments program. So there are plenty of other things that the Palestinians have to do in order to get things. Certainly there are obviously arguments on both sides that they should have to put forth some sort of confidence building measures to get the consulate open. I would say that if you're in that camp, the fact that they have been willing to re-engage with the United States through the Palestinian Affairs Unit before the consulate reopened, could be counted as a confidence building measure. So I'm sure people have suggestions on what they should be doing, but again, as I said at the very top, not having the consulate open isn't just about it being a favor to the Palestinians. It's also about the fact that not having the consulate is in many ways harming U.S. interests tangibly, and also, again, harming the U.S. position with regard to a two-state outcome. So, I don't look at this as a favor to the Palestinians. It's a matter of what makes sense for U.S. policy, and what makes sense for U.S. policy, in my view, is reopening the consulate.
Shira, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Michael. I think it's in U.S. interest, and also because the president said it, while campaigning, and then in office, and privately, and publicly, and the Secretary of State said that. I think it's also in U.S. interest to keep up its word, right? So there's if it's really in their interest that this is something that they want to act on, it's important that they do it. And if it's unimportant, then they could maybe reassess. I do believe that the Palestinian Authority, just to the question, needs to enact, to go through many reforms, even more than required by U.S. law. And this should not be a precondition to reopening the consulate. But I agree with, maybe I think that's the subtext or the premise of the question is what the PA should do. And there are a lot of things the PA should do, but when we don't have time to get into them, but I think except for its, support for what's known as the pay for slay, the prisoners' payments and other things, the fact is that in recent years, the PA has not been acting as a government that provides services and accountability to its people. And it hasn't. Security forces have become politicized, extremely politicized. They were by design, but it turned into something much crazy. Corruption, I know it's cliche to speak about it, but it's rampant. Let's say they should fulfill their duties when it comes to Gaza in terms of resources should be allocated, and also medical supplies and other things. Should the U.S. hold the PA accountable as it, seeks to restore ties and as it makes maybe demands from Israel? I think so, and I think the Biden administration is very much aware of this. Right, the idea is that we're not going to relaunch a peace process now, but we're going to ask both sides to act constructively and unilaterally to keep the door open for a two-state solution. And I think a functioning PA that's actually accountable and serving as a semi-functional government is definitely one of the pre-requirements for doing so. So yes.
Shira, I think you touched on this, but we have a question from Jason Berkovich. Outside of PA leadership, how much do everyday Palestinian people care about the reopening of the consulate? Do we have any sense?
Yeah, I mean, the PA cares, circles care. I think there is a sense in the public that, Jerusalem is important. So I think sort of there's such low anticipation and low expectation that something would happen. But if the US does it, this would resonate with a lot of Palestinians. It's not something that, bothers people day to day, right? Because you only do it if you need to go to get a visa for the US, and how many Palestinians go ask for a visa for the US? So it's not the logistical hurdles, but it is symbolically interested. I haven't seen any recent polling on this. I don't know if Michael has, in terms of what Palestinians think about it.
I haven't, but my bet is exactly what you said. That it's important, more important to them symbolically than it is important to them in terms of their day-to-day lives. Because as was pointed out in Jeff's question earlier, most Palestinians who engage with this, it's because they want visas, and that's not a very high percentage of the Palestinian population.
So we have some other questions that are not directly on this topic, but they are timely, and so I'm going to ask them. Nancy Kaplan and one other person who's anonymous are asking about the current brouhaha over Foreign Minister Gantz's decision to designate 6 Palestinian NGOs as terrorist organizations. Shira, do you want to start with that one?
Michael, you can start.
Okay.
So I was going to ask you if there's something more specific or just sort of generally.
Just in general, yeah, if you can comment on this and if we understand why this decision was undertaken and what are the implications. Is there any merit that we know of? And also I gather that this came as a bit of surprise to the administration. It wasn't something that was signaled in advance or not very far in advance.
It seems as if it was probably communicated to some arm of the U.S. government, but I think on a kind of on a low level, and sort of very vague in general. And then it seems as if the U.S. may have been surprised by the specificity and exactly what was going on. It's obviously been controversial. It's not just for this issue between the United States and Israel. It's been controversial inside of Israel as well. You've had this cause a lot of strain in the coalition because it seems as if Defense Minister Gantz did not notify other members of the coalition and other cabinet ministers. Whether he should have or shouldn't is a separate question. I'm not sure that as a general rule, the environmental minister has to be informed about designating groups as terrorist organizations, but certainly a bunch of the parties in the coalition feel as if they were blindsided. That's going to cause problems. In terms of the merits of it, honestly, I don't know enough to say. The PFLP is certainly a terrorist group. I don't think there's any question about that. Designated as such by Israel and by the United States. As to whether these 6 NGOs have ties to the PFLP, organizational ties, and not ties in the sense that some of their employees are affiliated with the PFLP. I don't know enough to say. I think that it will be smart of the Israeli government to put out whatever intelligence and information they have, so that people will be able to take this at face value. I think that one of the difficulties, aside from the fact that some of these groups are very well known, not only in Israel but in the United States as well. I think part of the difficulty is that for a while, not just this Israeli government, but the previous Israeli government have tended to describe anything they don't like as terrorism. So, PA officials are described as diplomatic terrorists, and BDS is described as economic terrorism. It's very possible that all 6 of these groups are involved in actual violence and actual terrorism. But I think without seeing the information, there are certainly people who are going to point to the fact that oftentimes terrorism is used as a way to forestall activity that the Israeli government may not like, but that is not terrorism. So hopefully they'll put out all the information they have, and everybody can judge on the merits.
Shira, do you want to add?
I think they will have to put out the information, even though they don't want to, because there are going to be tons of appeals to court, because some of these NGOs are really well established, known, funded by European countries. They're not funded by the United States, but they are funded by European countries. And, this is a public document, designation number 373 of the Minister of Defense. This is Al-Haq. So what it says here, it's a human rights organization. It practices on behalf, it's engaged on behalf of the Popular Front in promotion of steps against Israel in their international arena. I don't know, maybe if there's financing. So this is the public document. I think it's going to be incumbent upon the Minister of Defense now to show a little bit more evidence that this constitutes really terrorism, right? Not diplomatic terrorism, whatever language is used here. There was a heavy lift by NGO Monitor against these organizations that preceded this, and a lot of the language is taken directly from their documents, which is okay, if it has evidence and substance, right? So this is one of the questions, especially if Israel wants other countries to follow, right? If Israel wants the US to designate these organizations as terrorist organizations, it has to provide this evidence. There's a sense in Israel, Mike alluded it to, that is, what was the urgency of doing it now? What was so urgent? Why these organizations? Why do it such in a way that's it's kind of driven by the Ministry of Defense now? And I've heard from American officials saying this is sort of the first surprise in the no surprise, right? Israel's promised no surprises. And this is a mini surprise, because the way, it's not that no one provided notice, but I guess the notice was not the way should be expected.
By the way, I misspoke. I need to correct. I called Benny Gantz foreign minister, and of course he's Minister of Defense. Yair Lapid is foreign minister.
Yeah. Well, by the way, said I think said something today that they're going to be part of these discussions to avoid such situations in the future. But it's not just them, right? You have Meretz at the coalition. You have Gabi Lasky. She was the lawyer protecting some of these NGOs now in the Knesset. So you have it is an issue, and some of knowing these NGOs, I think the burden of proof is going to be something that the probably Minister of Defense would have rather avoid, but now they would have to do.
You're saying now he's forced to reveal what he knows, or what was the basis for the decision. We had a lot more questions I didn't get to, so I apologize to everyone for not being able to ask all your questions. We would need another hour for that, but of course, please do come back to future webinars and ask good questions, and I will get to you, I promise. So unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Michael, Shira, thank you so much for your time and for joining us. Once again, I want to thank all of our supporters who are with us on today's call, because your generosity makes programs like this one possible. And again, if you've not yet done so, really would urge you to consider making a contribution today at www.israelpolicyforum.org/support. The recording of this webinar will be posted on the briefings page of our website. As always, I also encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, sign up to receive the weekly Koplow column in your email inbox, and visit our website to access recordings of our previous briefings. Please stay tuned for an announcement regarding our next video briefing. And until then, thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you soon. Thanks. Bye.